Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a nation that calls itself the land of freedom while millions were never free. A nation that spoke of equality while building its power on exclusion, silence, and suffering. This is not a story meant to shame or glorify, but to awaken. Because history is not just about what happened long ago. It's about why the world looks the way it does today. Every law, every conflict, every unanswered question traces back to choices made in moments of fear and ambition. If you've ever wondered how a nation built on ideals could carry so much pain, stay with me. What you're about to hear isn't taught enough, isn't spoken plainly enough, and once you understand it, you will never see America or history the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. There is a story Americans like to tell themselves, a story of steady progress, of liberty widening with time, of a nation always bending toward justice. And there is truth in that story. But it is not the whole truth. Because beneath the soaring words and noble ideals lies a darker, more complicated history. One that must be faced honestly if the promise of America is to mean anything at all. America was born not in innocence, but in contradiction. In 1776, men gathered to declare that all were created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life and liberty. Yet many of those same men owned other human beings. This was not a footnote to the founding, it was central to it. Slavery was not a tragic accident of the American experiment. It was woven into its early economy, its politics, and its power. The wealth of the new nation flowed from fields worked by enslaved hands, while the language of freedom rang out from halls built on forced labor. From the very beginning, America lived with a split soul, one part reaching a moral greatness, the other clinging to mortal blindness. The darkness deepened as the nation expanded westward. The land that promised opportunity to some meant destruction for others. Native American nations with ancient cultures and deep spiritual ties to the land were pushed aside, broken by treaties signed and then ignored. The Trail of Tears was not merely a relocation. It was a march of suffering, hunger, and death, carried out by a government that spoke of civilization while practicing cruelty. Progress in this telling came at the cost of erasure. The Republic grew stronger, but only by silencing voices that had lived. On the continent long before the first European flag was planted, then came the Civil War, a reckoning born of decades of moral evasion. Hundreds of thousands died because the nation could no longer live with its contradictions. Slavery was finally abolished, but freedom arrived fragile and unfinished. Reconstruction held out the possibility of a more just America. Formerly enslaved people could fully participate in democracy. That possibility was violently crushed through lynching, terror, and law. White supremacy reasserted itself. Jim Crow was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate system designed to deny dignity and power to millions of citizens. The darkness did not disappear, it adapted. Even in the 20th century, as America rose to global prominence, the shadow followed. Segregation was enforced not just in the South, but across the nation in housing, education, employment, and opportunity. Immigrants were welcomed with one hand and rejected with the other, praised for their labor, yet feared for their presence. Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II, not for crimes committed, but for ancestry alone. Fear proved stronger than principle, even in a nation fighting tyranny abroad. And yet this is where the American story refuses to be only a story of despair. There were always those who resisted the darkness. Enslaved people who escaped, rebelled, and endured. Indigenous leaders who fought to preserve their nations and identities. Abolitionists, suffragists, labor organizers, civil rights marchers. Men and women who believed that America could be more than it was. They did not deny the nation's sins, they named them. And in naming them, they forced the country to change. The civil rights movement did not emerge from comfort. It rose from centuries of pain. It asked America to look at itself, to see the gap between its ideals and its actions. The victories it achieved were real, but they were not final. History does not move in straight lines, and progress is never permanent. Each generation inherits both the achievements and the unfinished work of those who came before. To speak honestly about America's dark history is not to hate the nation. It is, in fact, an act of faith that truth matters, that memory matters, and that a democracy strong enough to endure must also be brave enough to confront itself. Patriotism is not the denial of wrongdoing. It is the determination to learn from it. America's story is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a human story full of fear and hope, cruelty and courage. The darkness is real, but so is the light that has always pushed against it. The question that history leaves us with is not whether America has sinned. It has. The question is whether we will continue the long, difficult work of redemption. Because the future of the American experiment depends on remembering this truth. A nation that forgets its darkness risks repeating it, but a nation that faces it honestly may yet fulfill the promise it proclaimed at its birth. From the very beginning, America carried within it a profound moral tension that would shape every chapter of its history. The nation was conceived in the language of universal ideals, yet constructed within the limits of human fear, ambition, and self-interest. When the founders spoke of liberty and equality, they were reaching toward something larger than themselves, something timeless and aspirational. At the same time, they were men of their era, bound by inherited systems of power, economic dependency, and social hierarchy. The result was not hypocrisy in the shallow sense, but a deeper contradiction, one that would haunt the Republic long after the ink on its founding documents had dried. The Declaration of Independence announced a radical idea to the world, that legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed, and that all people possess natural rights no authority can rightfully take away. These words were not ordinary political rhetoric. They challenged monarchy, hierarchy, and the notion that power flowed downward from birth or bloodline. Yet in practice, the scope of this promise was sharply limited. The political community envisioned at the founding excluded women, Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and many poor white men. Liberty was proclaimed as a universal principle, but distributed as a privilege. This tension was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate compromise. The colonies that sought independence were not united by a single moral vision, but by a shared resentment of British control. Their economies, cultures, and social systems differed widely. Some were deeply dependent on slave labor, others were not. To form a union strong enough to survive, the founders chose accommodation over confrontation. Slavery was acknowledged but postponed, treated as a problem for a future generation to solve. In doing so, the new nation secured its birth, but at the cost of embedding injustice into its foundation. The Constitution itself reflected this uneasy balance. It established a framework for self-government remarkable in its durability and restraint. Yet it also contained silences and evasions that spoke volumes. Slavery was never named, but it was protected. Enslaved people were counted for representation, but denied personhood. The document promised liberty, yet deferred its full meaning. This was not simply moral failure. It was wager that time, growth and goodwill might resolve what courage would not address in the moment. Religion and Enlightenment philosophy both shaped this paradox. Many founders believed deeply in human equality as a spiritual or natural truth, yet doubted humanity's readiness to live up to it. They feared chaos as much as tyranny, and in that fear, they placed limits on their own ideals. The revolution, in their minds, was not meant to upend all social relations, but to preserve order while changing authority. Equality was acknowledged as a principle, but not enforced as a reality. The language of freedom nonetheless took on a life of its own. Once spoken aloud, it could not be contained. Enslaved people heard it and recognized its meaning. Women read it and saw their exclusion. Indigenous nations encountered it and questioned its selective application. The ideals of the founding became a mirror reflecting not only what America claimed to be, but what it refused to see. The contradiction between belief and behavior grew more visible with each passing decade. This moral dissonance shaped early American politics. Debates over taxation, representation, and federal power were also debates about who counted and who did not. Expansion westward intensified the conflict as new territories forced the nation to confront whether its ideals would trail with its borders. Each compromise postponed resolution but increased the cost of delay. The question of equality became inseparable from the question of survival. The founders often spoke of posterity, of future generations judging their work. In this, they were both hopeful and evasive. By leaving fundamental injustices unresolved, they handed their descendants a republic still in search of its moral center. The ideals they articulated became standards by which the nation would repeatedly be found wanting. Yet those same ideals also provided the language of reform, the tools with which critics could demand change. Contradiction between ideals and reality produced a uniquely American struggle. Unlike empires built on explicit hierarchy, the United States claimed moral authority through principle. This meant that injustice could never be fully justified without betraying the nation's own self-image. Every denial of rights stood in quiet opposition to the words that began the American story. Over time, this tension became a source of instability, but also of transformation. The belief in equality, however limited in practice, created expectations that could not be extinguished. It inspired movements, arguments, and sacrifices. It forced the nation into cycles of reckoning where promises made in moments of revolution had to be measured against lives lived in constraint. The contradiction was painful, but it was also productive, driving conflict that reshaped law, culture, and conscience. What emerged was not a clean narrative of progress, but an ongoing moral argument. America did not begin as a finished democracy. It began as a proposition. The founding ideals were not a description of reality, but a challenge to it. That challenge exposed the distance between who Americans were and who they claimed to be. It demanded choice after choice, generation after generation, about whether the nation would narrow its ideals to fit its behavior or broaden its behavior to match its ideals. This unresolved tension became the engine of American history. It shaped wars, amendments, movements, and migrations. It determined who could vote, who could own property, who could speak freely, and who could dream safely. The founding contradiction ensured that the past would never be settled, that the meaning of equality would remain contested and alive. It forced the nation to live in dialogue with its own conscience, to wrestle continuously with the gap between promise and practice, between belief and action, between the words that define the republic and the reality those words were meant to transform. Slavery was not a peripheral flaw in the American story. It was a central pillar upon which the early nation was built. Long before independence was declared, the economies of the colonies were shaped by human bondage. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton were not simply agricultural products. They were engines of wealth powered by enslaved labor. Ports flourished, merchants prospered, and governments collected revenue, all tied directly or indirectly to a system that treated human beings as property. Slavery was not hidden in the shadows of the American economy. It stood in full view, normalized, defended, and protected by law. The reach of slavery extended far beyond the plantations of the South. Northern shipbuilders constructed vessels used in the transatlantic trade. Banks insured enslaved people as assets. Textile mills depended on cotton harvested by forced labor. The idea that slavery was a regional anomaly is a comforting myth, one that obscures how deeply the institution shaped national growth. From the founding onward, American prosperity was intertwined with unfree labor, creating a moral debt that could not be confined to a single region or class. Slavery also shaped American politics at every level. The balance of power between free and slave states dominated national debate for decades. Laws were crafted to protect the interests of enslavers, from fugitive slave statutes to constitutional provisions that amplified the political power of slaveholding states. These were not passive accommodations, but active choices made to preserve unity and stability at the expense of justice. The federal government became, in effect, a guarantor of human bondage. The legal system reinforced this reality. Courts upheld the rights of slave owners while denying the humanity of the enslaved. Enslaved people existed in a legal limbo, punished under criminal law, yet denied protection under civil law. They could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and inherited. Families were separated at the whim of owners. Violence was not an aberration of the system. It was essential to its operation. Terror maintained order, and law gave terror legitimacy. Culturally, slavery distorted American values. It required the construction of racial ideologies that justified cruelty as necessity and exploitation as destiny. Pseudoscience, theology, and custom were bent to serve a single purpose, to convince. A society founded on liberty that bondage was not only acceptable but natural. These beliefs did not vanish with emancipation. They lingered, shaping attitudes, institutions, and inequalities long after slavery's formal end. The enslaved life was defined by endurance and resistance. They labored under constant surveillance, faced punishment for the smallest acts of defiance, and lived with the ever-present threat of separation from loved ones. Yet within these conditions, they forged communities, preserved culture, and asserted humanity in countless ways. Resistance took many forms: escape, rebellion, sabotage, faith in survival itself. These acts challenged the lie that enslaved people were passive victims, revealing instead a relentless struggle for dignity. The wealth extracted from enslaved labor did more than enrich individuals. It financed national expansion. Infrastructure, universities, and industries benefited from profits rooted in slavery. Even institutions that would later claim moral leadership were often sustained by money earned through exploitation. The legacy of this accumulation did not disappear when slavery ended. It shaped patterns of ownership, opportunity, and power that would persist for generations. As debates over slavery intensified, the nation attempted compromise after compromise, each one deepening the crisis. Rather than confronting the moral reality of human bondage, leaders chose delay. These choices allowed slavery to expand westward, entrenching it further into the national fabric. By the time conflict became unavoidable, the institution had grown too large, too powerful to dismantle peacefully. The Civil War was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was the inevitable outcome of a system built on contradiction and sustained by denial. Emancipation marked a turning point, but not a clean break. Slavery ended in law, but its influence endured in economics, politics, and social structure. Freed people emerged into a society that had long profited from their oppression, but refused to grant them full equality. The nation moved forward without fully accounting for what slavery had taken or it had built. The absence of restitution, the failure of land reform, and the retreat from Reconstruction ensured that the end of slavery did not mean the end of racial hierarchy. The centrality of slavery to American history challenges comforting narratives of gradual progress and moral inevitability. It reveals a nation willing to sacrifice human lives for wealth and stability, and equally willing to rationalize that sacrifice in the language of law and tradition. Slavery was not an unfortunate deviation from American ideals. It existed alongside them, supported by them, and in many cases shielded by them. The Republic grew strong not despite slavery, but in many ways because of it. Understanding slavery as foundational rather than incidental changes how the past is remembered and how the present is understood. It explains disparities that did not arise by accident, resentments that did not emerge from nowhere, and struggles that did not begin in the modern era. It forces a reckoning with the reality that freedom for some was built on captivity for others. and that the benefits of that arrangement were inherited long after the chains were removed. Slavery shaped the nation's character, its institutions, and its moral challenges, leaving a legacy that continues to influence American life, embedded in the structures of society, the distribution of power, and the unresolved questions of justice and accountability. The story of America's expansion is often told as a tale of courage and opportunity, of pioneers moving westward in search of land and freedom. Yet for Native American nations, same movement marked the beginning of displacement, betrayal, and survival against overwhelming force. Long before the United States existed, indigenous peoples had established complex societies, systems of governance, trade networks, and spiritual relationships with the land. Their presence was not incidental to the continent. It was foundational. But from the earliest days of the Republic, their sovereignty was treated as an obstacle rather than a reality to be respected. Treaties were the language through which the United States claimed legitimacy in its dealings with native nations. On paper, these agreements recognized tribes as distinct political entities, capable of negotiation and entitled to protection. In practice, treaties became tools of dispossession. They were signed under coercion, misrepresented through translation, or ignored once they ceased to serve American interests. Promises of peace, land, and mutual respect were repeatedly broken, not by accident, but by design. Expansion demanded land, and land required removal. The pressure intensified as the young nation grew more confident in its power. The idea of manifest destiny took hold, casting westward expansion as not only inevitable, but divinely sanctioned. This belief transformed conquest into righteousness and violence into virtue. Indigenous peoples were no longer neighbors or nations. They were portrayed as impediments to progress, obstacles standing in the way of civilization. Such language made cruelty easier, even necessary. In the minds of those who benefited from removal, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 marked a turning point, translating long-standing hostility into federal policy. Under the guise of relocation, entire nations were forced from their ancestral homelands. The Cherokee, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole were among those, driven westward despite legal victories affirming their rights. The Trail of Tears stands as one of the clearest symbols of this injustice, but it was not an isolated event. Thousands died from exposure, disease, and starvation, their suffering sanctioned by a government that claimed to stand for liberty and law. Removal did not end the violence. As settlers continued west, conflict followed. Military campaigns targeted tribes who resisted displacement, often resulting in massacres rather than battles. Villages were destroyed and food supplies burned and families scattered. Even treaties meant to establish permanent reservations were temporary. In practice, shrinking whenever new resources were discovered. Gold, fertile soil, and railroads repeatedly outweighed indigenous rights. Each promise of permanence dissolved under economic pressure. Cultural destruction accompanied physical displacement. Boarding schools sought to erase indigenous identities, stripping children of language, tradition, and family ties. Kill the Indian, save the man became a guiding philosophy, reflecting the belief that survival required assimilation and submission. Generations grew up severed from their heritage, taught to view their own culture as inferior or shameful. This violence was quieter than removal, but no less devastating in its long-term effects. The legal framework of the United States reinforced this hierarchy. Court decisions often acknowledged tribal sovereignty in theory while limiting it in practice. Native nations were described as domestic dependent nations, a phrase that reduced independence while maintaining control. Citizenship, when eventually granted, came without meaningful power. Land allotment policies fractured communal ownership, transferring millions of acres to non-native hands. What was presented as reform functioned as another mechanism of loss. Despite these pressures, indigenous resistance never ceased. Some resisted through armed defense, others through diplomacy, cultural preservation, and adaptation. Leaders emerged who sought to navigate an impossible landscape, negotiating with a government that rarely acted in good faith. Communities found ways to endure, holding onto traditions even as they were outlawed or discouraged. Survival itself became an act of defiance. The consequences of displacement extended far beyond the 19th century. Poverty, health disparities, and limited access to education and resources are not accidents of geography, but outcomes of deliberate policy. Reservations were often placed on land considered undesirable, far from economic opportunity. Promises of federal support were inconsistently honored, leaving communities dependent on systems that failed to deliver stability or justice. Memory plays a central role in how this history is understood. For generations, Indigenous perspectives were marginalized or erased from national narratives. Textbooks celebrated expansion while glossing over its human cost. The language of discovery replaced the reality of invasion. This selective memory allowed the nation to celebrate its growth without reckoning with the suffering that made it possible. To acknowledge broken treaties is to confront a pattern of governance rooted in expedience rather than principle. Agreements were honored only as long as they aligned with American ambition. When they did not, legality gave way to force. This pattern undermined not only indigenous sovereignty, but the moral authority of the state itself. A nation that defined itself by law repeatedly violated its own commitments when power made violation convenient. Indigenous nations continue to assert their rights, drawing on treaty law, cultural resilience, and historical truth. Their struggle is not solely about land, but about recognition, dignity, and self-determination. The past remains present in legal battles, environmental conflicts, and efforts to protect sacred sites. Each challenge echoes centuries of resistance against erasure. The story of displacement is not confined to a distant era. It lives in the names of places, the boundaries of states, and the distribution of wealth and power. It shapes relationships between governments and communities, between memory and identity. To confront this history is to question the cost of progress and the meaning of justice in a nation built on land, taken by force, through promises made and broken, through survival against a system determined to remove, redefine, and replace those who stood in the way of expansion. The end of slavery was supposed to mark a moral turning point, a moment when the nation finally aligned its laws with its professed belief in human equality. The 13th Amendment abolished bondage, but it did not erase the structures that slavery had built or the attitudes that sustained it. Freedom arrived into a hostile landscape where former enslavers sought new ways to maintain power and where the federal government's commitment to justice proved fragile and temporary. Emancipation closed one chapter of oppression while opening another, less visible but equally consequential. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was a brief and remarkable effort to reconstruct the South on more democratic foundations. Newly freed Black Americans voted, held office, built schools, churches, and businesses, and attempted to claim the full meaning of citizenship. For a moment, the promise of the founding ideals seemed within reach. This period terrified those who had long ruled through racial hierarchy. The idea of equality was no longer abstract. It was taking form in real political power. The backlash was swift and violent. White supremacist groups emerged not as fringe movements, but as organized forces aimed at restoring racial control. Terror became a political tool. Lynchings, assaults, and intimidation were used to suppress Black participation in civic life. Violence was not random. It was strategic, designed to send a clear message about who truly belonged and who did not. Law enforcement often looked away or actively participated, reinforcing the sense that justice was conditional and selective. When federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, the fragile gains of Reconstruction collapsed. State governments moved quickly to codify racial inequality through Jim Crow laws. Segregation became the law of the land, governing schools, transportation, housing, employment, and public life. These laws were justified as maintaining order or tradition, but their purpose was unmistakable: to enforce racial separation and ensure black subordination. The Supreme Court lent its authority to this system, declaring segregation constitutional as law. As it was separate but equal, a phrase that masked profound inequality behind legal language. Economic oppression reinforced legal segregation. Sharecropping and debt peonage replaced slavery with systems that trapped black families in cycles of poverty. Access to land, credit, and fair wages was systematically denied. Education for black children was underfunded and neglected, limiting opportunity, while reinforcing stereotypes used to justify discrimination. The economy functioned in a way that extracted labor while denying advancement, preserving a racial caste system without chains. Jim Crow was not confined to the South. In northern cities, segregation operated through custom, policy, and violence rather than explicit law. Housing discrimination, redlining, and restrictive covenants confined black families to certain neighborhoods, cutting them off from wealth-building opportunities. Employment discrimination limited access to stable jobs, while unions often excluded black workers. The promise of freedom meant little when opportunity was systematically withheld. The psychological toll of this system was immense. Segregation taught lessons every day about worth and belonging. It signaled who could move freely and who had to be careful, who could expect protection and who could expect suspicion. These messages were reinforced by media, education, and popular culture, shaping perceptions of race for generations. The lie of racial inferiority became embedded in national consciousness, influencing how Americans saw one another and themselves. Resistance never disappeared. Black communities organized, protested, educated, and challenged injustice through churches, newspapers, courts, and grassroots movements. Each act of resistance carried risk, yet the demand for dignity persisted. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century did not emerge suddenly. It was the culmination of decades of struggle against a system designed to exhaust hope and punish defiance. When legal segregation finally began to fall, it did so under immense pressure. Court decisions and legislation dismantled the formal structure of Jim Crow, but the deeper inequalities remained. The end of segregation did not automatically produce equality. Wealth gaps, educational disparities, and unequal access to justice reflected generations of exclusion. The structures built to enforce racial hierarchy did not disappear, they adapted. Mass incarceration emerged as a new mechanism of control, disproportionately affecting black communities and echoing earlier systems of forced labor and disenfranchisement. Voting rights, once violently suppressed, faced new restrictions through bureaucratic means. Economic inequality persisted, shaped by historical denial of opportunity. The language changed, but the consequences often remained familiar. The legacy of racial oppression after emancipation reveals how deeply inequality was woven into American life. Jim Crow was not an aberration between slavery and civil rights. It was a deliberate continuation of racial control by other means. It shaped institutions, policies, and attitudes that outlived the law themselves. The nation moved forward without fully confronting the damage inflicted or the benefits accrued through exclusion. Understanding this history requires abandoning the idea that injustice was confined to the distant past or the actions of a few individuals. Racial oppression was systemic, sustained by government authority, economic interest, and social acceptance. It shaped where people lived, how they worked, how they were educated, and how they were treated by the law. The effects accumulated over time, producing inequalities that could not be undone by a single reform or generation. The struggle after emancipation exposes the limits of legal freedom without social and economic justice. It shows how easily rights can be hollowed out when power remains unequal. The promise of citizenship, like the promise of freedom before it, was offered conditionally, enforced selectively, and resisted fiercely by those who feared its implications. The long shadow of Jim Crow demonstrates how a nation can proclaim equality, while constructing systems that deny it in practice, how progress can coexist with profound injustice, and how the work of democracy remains unfinished, shaped by choices made in fear, defended by habit, and challenged by those who refuse to accept a narrow definition of freedom. American history is defined by a constant struggle between injustice and the ideals of democracy, a tension that has never been fully resolved and has shaped the nation's character across centuries. From the beginning, democratic language coexisted with exclusion, and the promise of self-government was extended unevenly. This conflict did not weaken the republic, it became the force that tested it. Each generation inherited both the benefits of earlier progress and the unresolved failures that progress left behind. Democracy in America was never a settled achievement. It functioned more as an aspiration, challenged repeatedly by fear, inequality, and the desire for control. When those in power felt threatened, democratic principles were often narrowed or suspended. Voting rights were restricted, dissent was punished, and whole communities were excluded from participation. Yet even in these moments, the language of democracy endured, waiting to be reclaimed by those denied its protections. Moments of crisis exposed the fragility of democratic commitments. Wars, economic collapse, and social upheaval frequently prompted the erosion of civil liberties. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II demonstrated how quickly constitutional rights could be overridden by fear. Political repression during periods of unrest showed how dissent was treated as disloyalty. These episodes revealed that democracy required more than institutions. It depended on courage and restraint, qualities not always present in moments of uncertainty. At the same time, the struggle for justice produced some of the nation's most transformative movements. Abolitionists challenged the legitimacy of a republic that tolerated slavery. Suffragists questioned a democracy that denied women the vote. Labor organizers confronted economic systems that excluded workers from political power. Civil rights activists exposed the contradictions of a nation that proclaimed equality while enforcing segregation. Each movement faced resistance not only from the state, but from citizens invested in preserving existing hierarchies. Progress was rarely smooth or inevitable. Gains were often followed by backlash. The expansion of voting rights was met with new forms of suppression. Advances in civil liberties were countered by surveillance and repression. Democracy advanced through conflict, not consensus. The idea that the nation naturally moved toward justice obscured the reality that justice had to be demanded, defended, and renewed. The courts played a central role in this struggle, sometimes expanding rights, sometimes restricting them. Legal victories often depended on broader social movements to give them meaning. Without enforcement, laws remained symbolic. The distance between legal equality and lived equality persisted, revealing the limits of reform that did not address underlying power structures. Economic inequality repeatedly tested democratic ideals. Concentrated wealth translated into political influence, shaping policy and limiting access to opportunity. Those without economic security often lacked meaningful political voice, even when formal rights existed. This imbalance challenged the notion of government by the people, raising questions about whose interests democracy truly served. Race, class, gender, and immigration status intersected to define who belonged within the democratic community. Inclusion expanded unevenly, often requiring constitutional amendments, court battles, and mass protests. Each expansion faced arguments that it threatened stability or tradition. These arguments echoed across time, revealing a recurring fear that democracy became less secure when it became more inclusive. The media and education systems shaped how democracy was understood and remembered. Narratives emphasizing unity and progress sometimes minimized conflict and injustice. By smoothing over struggle, these stories weakened democratic vigilance. A democracy that forgets how rights were won risks losing them. Memory became a battleground, determining whether injustice was seen as an anomaly or a pattern. Democratic ideals also face challenges from within the electorate. Demagoguery, misinformation, and polarization tested the capacity of citizens to govern themselves. When trust eroded, the temptation to seek order through authority increased. History showed that democracy could be undermined not only by elites, but by popular movements willing to trade pluralism for certainty. Despite these challenges, the democratic impulse persisted. It survived because it was claimed by those excluded, not just protected by those in power. The struggle itself became a defining feature of American democracy. The constant push to align practice with principle forced the nation to confront its contradictions again and again. This ongoing conflict shaped institutions, laws, and political culture. It influenced debates over federal power, individual rights, and collective responsibility. It defined moments of reform and moments of retreat. Democracy did not stand apart from injustice. It existed in tension with it, shaped by choices made under pressure. The American experiment endured not because it avoided failure, but because it contained mechanisms for self-correction, however imperfect. Protest, litigation, and civic engagement became tools to challenge injustice. These tools were often resisted, sometimes violently, yet they remained available, reflecting a belief that authority could be questioned and power contested. The struggle between injustice and democratic ideals revealed democracy as a process rather than a destination. It demanded participation, sacrifice, and constant reevaluation. Rights once secured required protection. Freedoms once expanded faced new limitations. Each generation confronted the same fundamental question of whether the nation's principle would be narrowed to protect power or expanded to include those long excluded. This tension defined the moral life of the Republic. It shaped the way Americans argued, voted, protested, and imagined the future. The story of democracy in America was not one of steady ascent, but of recurring challenge, where ideals were tested by reality, and reality was reshaped by ideals, leaving a legacy of struggle that continued to influence political life, civic identity, and the unfinished work of aligning justice with the promise of self-government. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.